All right, so today we're going deep on climate change.
Really diving in.
Yeah, we've got a ton of research and reports, even some firsthand accounts.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah, to really try and understand, what's happening to our planet.
It's amazing to me how it's gone from like a scientific theory
Right.
to something that we're actually seeing the impacts of.
Exactly, and I think that's why it's so important that we're doing this right now.
Yeah.
Because it feels like it's this giant puzzle,
Yeah. Yeah.
We see rising temperatures, melting glaciers, extreme weather events.
Right.
But how does it all fit together?
Yeah, well, that's where understanding the science comes in.
Okay, so let's start there, like the foundation.
Go.
Greenhouse gases,
Yeah.
climate systems, global warming.
Okay, so think of it like this. The Earth has a very delicate temperature balance, right?
Okay.
It's like a thermostat that's set just right for life to thrive. And there are certain gases in our atmosphere called greenhouse gases
Right.
that act like a blanket, and they trap some of the sun's heat. And that's a natural process, and it's what keeps our planet habitable.
So it's like a cozy blanket on a cold night.
Exactly.
But when you have too much of a good thing, it becomes a problem.
Exactly. And that's where we've run into trouble because human activities, primarily burning fossil fuels,
Right.
have been pumping way too many greenhouse gases into the atmosphere.
Okay.
So that blanket is getting thicker.
So it's trapping more heat, and that's where we get global warming from.
Yeah, global warming is kind of the common term. But it's important to remember that it's not just about the Earth getting warmer.
Right.
It's about all the knock-on effects of that warming.
Yeah.
Changes in weather patterns, rising sea levels, melting ice caps,
Yeah.
and disrupted ecosystems. And that's why scientists use the broader term climate change.
So it's not just like a steady increase in temperature everywhere.
Right.
It's about how the whole system is kind of getting out of whack.
Exactly. And these changes, they're not uniform. So some regions
Right.
experience more dramatic shifts than others.
Okay. And that's, I guess, where we get into like regional climate change.
Precisely.
Okay. Well, this is where I start to think like, okay, what does the future hold?
Yeah.
Because we've got all this data now. So what are scientists predicting?
Well, they use very sophisticated computer models to project future climate scenarios.
Okay.
And these models take into account a huge number of factors.
Right.
And while they can't tell us exactly what's going to happen,
Of course.
they give us a pretty clear picture of what we're up against.
So what are some of the things these models are showing us?
Well, projections show a continued rise in global temperatures
Okay.
and potentially going past critical thresholds that could trigger some really big irreversible changes.
Like what kind of changes are we talking about?
Well, we're talking more frequent and intense heat waves, prolonged droughts in some areas,
Okay.
increased rainfall and flooding in others.
That sounds pretty intense. What about sea level rise? Because we hear a lot about that.
Yeah, sea level rise is a major concern because as glaciers and ice sheets melt at an accelerated rate,
Right.
the volume of water in the oceans is increasing. And that, combined with the fact that water expands as it warms, leads to significant sea level rise, potentially inundating coastal communities and displacing millions of people.
It's like we're watching a slow motion disaster unfold.
Yeah, it really is.
So we often hear about climate change on this global scale.
Yeah.
But how does that translate down to like regional impacts?
That's a really crucial point because even though the overall trend is global warming, the specific impacts vary significantly from region to region.
Okay.
So some areas might experience much more extreme heat waves, while others face increased rainfall and flooding.
Okay.
Coastal regions are particularly vulnerable to that sea level rise,
Right.
while arid regions might experience even more severe droughts.
So it's really about not just understanding the whole science of climate change, but also looking at these specific impacts on different regions.
Absolutely, and understanding these regional nuances is critical for developing effective adaptation and mitigation strategies.
So we've laid some of the groundwork here for understanding the science of climate change,
Yeah.
but where do we go from here? Like, what's the next layer?
Well, the next layer is really exploring the ripple effects of these changes,
Okay.
the environmental and socioeconomic impacts of climate change.
So that's really where the urgency lies
Exactly.
in understanding what those impacts really look like and what we can do about it.
Absolutely.
That's what we'll be diving into in the next part of our deep dive on climate change. So stay tuned because we're going to really explore how climate change is reshaping our world.
Welcome back. So last time we really dug into the science behind climate change,
Yeah,
but it's not just about graphs and data points, right? It's about what we're seeing happening in the world around us.
absolutely. Climate change is disrupting that delicate balance of life on Earth.
So let's talk about those impacts.
Yeah.
What are some of the biggest ways climate change is affecting biodiversity and ecosystems? Okay, well, you can imagine a forest that's adapted to a specific temperature and rainfall pattern over hundreds of years, right?
Yeah.
And suddenly those conditions are changing really rapidly.
Yeah.
Some species might be able to migrate to more suitable habitats, but others, especially those that can't move easily or have very specific needs,
Right.
they're going to face a real struggle to survive.
It's like pulling the rug out from under them. Are there like specific examples we can point to that are happening right now?
Oh, absolutely. We're seeing coral reefs bleaching and dying as ocean temperatures rise.
Wow.
Those reefs are like vibrant underwater cities teeming with life.
Yeah.
And when they bleach, it's like watching a metropolis turn into a ghost town.
That's a powerful image. And what about on land? Are we seeing similar things happening?
Definitely in mountainous areas, alpine species are being pushed higher and higher up the slopes as temperatures rise.
Right.
And eventually they just run out of room to move.
Right.
And their habitat disappears. And that's actually got a name. It's called mountaintop extinction.
It's like climate change is squeezing life out of these ecosystems.
Yeah, it really is.
And speaking of squeezing, what about water resources? How is climate change impacting the availability and quality of water around the world?
Yeah, water is essential for all life, right? And climate change is really throwing a wrench into that global water cycle.
Okay.
We're already seeing more intense droughts in some regions,
Right.
leading to water scarcity and competition for this vital resource.
Yeah.
At the same time, other areas are experiencing heavier rainfall and flooding, which can contaminate water supplies and damage infrastructure.
So it's a double-edged sword, too little water in some places, too much in others,
Exactly.
and often not the quality we need.
Right.
So what does this mean for people who rely on these water sources?
It means increased risk to human health, disruptions to agriculture and food production,
Okay.
and challenges for industries that depend on reliable water supplies. It's a whole cascade of impacts that ripples through societies and economies.
This is painting a pretty bleak picture, and it's easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of these changes.
Yeah,
But I think the next step is to talk about the human cost.
absolutely.
How is climate change affecting people's lives, their livelihoods, their communities?
And that's where we get into the socioeconomic impacts of climate change.
Okay.
We're talking about implications for global and local economies, the challenges to social equity,
Right.
and the potential for climate-induced migration and conflict.
Yeah.
These are really complex issues.
And those are exactly the things that we're going to be exploring in the next part of our deep dive.
That's right.
We're going to connect the dots between those environmental changes and the human consequences of climate change. So stay with us as we unpack this critical dimension of the climate crisis. So welcome back to the final part of our deep dive on climate change.
Yeah, it's been a lot to take in, hasn't it?
Yeah, from the science of greenhouse gases to, melting glaciers and ecosystems struggling to survive.
Oh.
But I think, the most crucial part is to talk about how this affects us as humans.
Right.
So what is the human cost of climate change?
Well, that's where things get really complicated because climate change is a threat multiplier.
Oh,
It doesn't just create problems out of thin air.
Right.
It takes existing inequalities and vulnerabilities and it makes them so much worse.
Can you give us like a concrete example of what you mean?
Sure, imagine a coastal community
Okay.
that's already struggling with poverty and lack of resources.
Right.
Now picture rising sea levels encroaching on their homes and businesses, displacing families, crippling their local economy.
Yeah.
Climate change just amplifies those existing problems.
Like a domino effect. One problem just leads to another.
Exactly. And we see this happening on a global scale with economies, too.
Right.
Think about the impacts on agriculture, infrastructure, entire industries.
Yeah.
Climate change can disrupt those critical supply chains, increase the cost of goods and services,
Yeah.
and even lead to global instability.
So it's not just an environmental issue, it's a socioeconomic one as well.
Precisely. And we can't ignore the fact that the impacts of climate change are not felt equally around the world.
Right.
Vulnerable populations, particularly in developing countries and marginalized communities, they are hit the hardest.
It really is an issue of social equity, isn't it?
Absolutely. Climate justice means recognizing that those who have contributed the least to climate change
Right.
often suffer the most from its consequences.
And that everyone has a right to a safe and healthy environment, no matter who they are or where they live.
Exactly.
So we've talked about economic impacts, social equity, but there's one more piece of the puzzle, right?
Yeah.
Climate change as a driver of migration and conflict.
Yeah, that's a growing concern. as resources become more scarce and environments become less and less livable, people are forced to move.
Right.
This can lead to people being displaced within their own countries,
Yeah.
as well as mass migrations across borders.
Yeah.
And that puts a strain on resources, creates tensions, and can even fuel conflict.
It's like a reminder that climate change has all these far-reaching consequences that go way beyond, the immediate environmental impacts.
Yeah, we have to think about it holistically. The environment, society, and the economy, they're all interconnected.
So where do we go from here? Because it's easy to feel completely overwhelmed by the scale of this problem.
I get it. The challenges are huge, but it's not a hopeless situation.
Okay.
We have the knowledge, the technology, and the resources to make a difference.
So what can we do as individuals? I mean, does our small contribution really matter?
Every action counts.
Okay.
It's about making informed choices in our daily lives, supporting policies that promote sustainability, and holding our leaders accountable for taking real action.
Right.
It's about raising awareness, starting those conversations, and working together to build a better future.
It really is a call to action for all of us. And I think, we've explored the science, we've seen the impacts on the environment. We've talked about the human cost of climate change.
It's complicated.
It's complex, but it's something that demands our attention.
Absolutely.
And our action.
Yeah.
So thank you for joining us today.
It's been great talking with you.
I hope this deep dive has given you some valuable insights and maybe spurred a sense of, urgency to address this really defining challenge of our time.
I hope so.
Remember, the future really does depend on what we choose to do today. So thank you for listening.